it's not, you don't have so much schach. It's very minimal amount of schach. You just have, you just have more shade than sun, but the schach is very scarce and there's spaces in between. And the Mishnah said that that's a kosher sukkah, and the chidush, the novelty is that even you're not afraid that maybe some of the schach will fall off with the wind, and you might not be aware that it fell off, and then you won't be aware that there's more sun than shade. So that's how the Ritva explains there's a chidush in the Mishnah. The Mishnah teaches us that we're not afraid of such a thing. As long as you have more shade than sun, you're good. Even though
Rabbi, is it kosher for the people who are not sitting under the skach and they're sitting under the part that's sun?
It seems that as long as they're in the sukkah as a whole has more shade than sun, that's what it would seem like. We could look into it more, but the fact is there always could be a spot that's a little bit more the sun is a little bit more sun. But the question is, it's a question about the sukkah. Is the sukkah more, we look at the sukkah as a whole, and if the sukkah has more shade than sun, so we would identify that sukkah that it's considered a kosher sukkah. That's what it would seem to be. Maybe we have to look at more into halacha to see, that they state that openly, but that should be the law, because it's a kosher sukkah, because there's more shade than sun and a whole. That was one thing that the Mishnah stated. Then the Mishnah had another idea. This is how one of the rabbis interpret the Mishnah, that if you have schach and the schach is not directly lined up one bamboo stick next to the other bamboo stick, but rather, let's say it's on an angle diagonally, one piece of schach is higher than the others. And the Gemara said, Mishnah also stated, that the rabbi understood the meaning of the Mishnah is that we look, as long as the schach is within 9 to 12 inches of the other pieces of schach, which means within 3 tvachim, we look at it as if it's connected, and we look at it as if it's connected, so much so that even if at this state there's more sun coming in than shade, but if this piece of schach, which is there, which is above the ceiling, which is the part of your new roof, if it would be flat down, if it would be down next to the other piece of schach, it would create more shade than sun. So even if at this moment there's more sun than shade coming into the sukkah, but the fact that you have, so to speak, a schach on top of you that's within connected to the other schach, which close proximity to the other schach, so we view it. So so here comes like the legality that even though in actuality there's more sun than schach at the moment in the sukkah, but the fact that you have on top of your schach that if it would be lowered down, it would create more shade than schach. We could view it as if it's lower down. That's like a very big novelty. We view the schach that's above you, even though it's not actually providing at the moment more shade than sun, but the potential that's there, if it would just be down a little lower, it would provide it. So we consider it as if it's there. So that's like a very big chidush, a very big novelty that we look at it in such a fashion, and that makes it. We look at, that's called a sukkah. That means you have on top of you, you have something that's on top of you that we look at it as if it's creating that shade, and that would make it a kosher sukkah. That was a big chidush. Then comes Rava, comes Abaye, and Abaye says, but if you would have 3 tvachim, if you would have a space between this piece of schach and that piece of schach of 9 inches or 9 to 12 inches, then we don't look at it as if it's next to it. We don't connect the dots. because there's too much of a distance between this piece of schach and that piece of schach. We don't look at it as if they're connected. That's what Abaye says. If there's more than three tvachim, if there's 3 tvachim, if there's 9 to 12 inches of spacing between. Yeah, I don't know what happened to the screen. We're back. You're back. You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay. So then comes Abaye. Abaye says that if you have too much space between the schach from this piece of schach and that piece of schach, we if it's 3 tvachim or more, even if it would be, even as is, if it would be lowered, it would provide more shade than sun. But if it's too much space between this piece of schach and that piece of schach, we don't connect the dots, and therefore we don't look at it as if it's lower down. That's what Abaye says. Then comes Rava, and Rava says even if there's spacing between this piece of schach and that piece of schach of 3 tvachim, if the schach itself has a width of a tefach, if the schach itself has a width of 3 to 4 inches, let's say it's a nice thick, nice wide piece of bamboo. So if it's 3 to 4, if it's at least 1 tefach, if it's 3 to 4 inches wide, then we look at this schach as if it's then it comes down. Then we consider it as there's a new law that we say it's called chavut rami, that we take an item that's directly on top of something else, and if it has a certain width, it's like a certain type of roof. That roof, that width creates a certain roof, which is like it's a tefach, and that tefach we consider it as if it's lower down. So therefore, we have this phenomenon. I have a sukkah, I have the walls of a sukkah, I have schach over here, but I have other schach that's raised up that could even be more than 3 tvachim. More than 3 tvachim, more than 9 to 12 inches from the other schach, but it's hovering right over the sukkah. We look at it as if this comes down and fills the gap. So it means if you have some sort of a tefach is like 3 to 4 inches, is considered the size of a tent. If you want something to be considered a tent, have the ability to act as a tent, a covering, there's a minimum height, width to be a covering, which is a tefach. So if the sukkah covering is a tefach, if this bamboo is a tefach wide, so then we will look at it as if it came and it filled the gap. That was Rava's contribution here. And then the Gemara said, Amar Rava mina minala. And then the Gemara says, how does Rava know this idea that it has to be the schach, the width of the schach, in order for it to look at it as if it's lower down and fills the gap on top of the sukkah, if it's a tefach wide. If it's less than a tefach, let's say it's only half 2 inches wide, then we're not going to say, we don't look at it as if it comes down and fills the gap. So that's what the Gemara today is focusing on. That's what the Gemara is on 22a. 22A2 on the first column. Amar Rava. Rava says, Minah minallah. How do I know the chi'it be tefach? If there's a width, if the schach itself has the width of a tefach, amrinan chavod rami. We look at this schach in a way that we say we lower it down. We consider it lower down. V'chilet be, when it doesn't have the size of a tefach, if this piece of schach doesn't form a roof because it's less than a tefach, lo amrina chavod rami. We do not say chavod rami. We don't say it fills the gap. The Gemara says it none. We learned in a Mishnah. Korot habayit v'haliyah. If you have the beams of a house or a two-floor house, which is the bayit is the first floor, that's called the house, the main floor. Then there's the aliyah, which is the upper floor, the second floor. And they're constructing the house, and it's in its raw state that they put the beams, so they have the beams up for the first floor, the beams that will hold up the ceiling for the first floor. So they put up the beams, and eventually they're going to put on top of the beams, they're going to put boards and cement, and they're going to.
What's the word for beams?
A korah, kuf vav reish hey. It's a very important word because we're going to have it. It's used in other areas as well. We're going to see coming up in the Gemara. So if you place this, if you have the korah, let's say you set the beams coming out from from wall to wall, you have the beam going across, which will eventually be the ceiling. The beams will be the ceiling for the first floor, and then you have beams, which is the ceiling for the second floor, which will be the roof of the house. So you have the beams coming out from you have for the first floor, the beams of the first floor, which will be the flooring for the second floor, and then you have the beams for the second floor, which will be the roof for the house. So you have these beams. And the himuchuvonot, morning Adam. You didn't put the plaster in the beams, you didn't fill in the gaps of the beams, you didn't go ahead and put the boards on top of the beams, and you went ahead and the beams are right on top of each other. We are on 22A, 22A2. So the beams are right on top of each other, and now what's the issue? So you have the first floor beams and the second floor on top of each other. And there's tumah underneath one of the beams. So let's say tachat. Let's say it's under the bottom, the first floor beams. There's tumah. Let's say there's a mate. There's a dead body. Certain parts of the dead body that are underneath that beam. And that dead body. Now we know when there's a corpse underneath a beam, underneath a tent. So whatever's inside that tent will become contaminated as a result of being under that tent. So now here we have a long beam, right? So we have this long beam going from one end to the other. So if on one end of the beam, under one end of the beam, there is a corpse. So the other end, whatever's under the other end of the beam will be considered also contaminated. I mean, if there's food, if there's utensils on the other side of the beam, because it's under the same roofing, provided that the beam has a width of a tefach, then whatever's underneath that beam will be considered contaminated because it's under a tent. The beam forms a tent. Now, but the beam not only forms a tent, it also will stop. It will stop, like Adam says, that contamination from going above the beam, because the beam on the one hand is a tent, but it also, and therefore what's underneath it will become contaminated, but it will stop it from going above the beam. So that's the first point that happens over here. So if there's tumah tachat achat mehem, it's under the bottom floor beams. So we say, Tachteha Tameh. What is underneath that beam would be considered contaminated. Now, if it's being Tachtona Lelyona, if the contamination, let's say the corpse, the part of the body of the tumah, is between beam number 1 and beam number 2, let's say it's right on top, it's sitting on top of the beams from the first floor. So then we say, Beinehem Tameh. So being that the beams are lined up one on top of the other, so anything between beam number 1 and beam number 2, the beams from the bottom floor and the beams from the top floor, that whole between that will become contaminated, because the second floor beams serves as a tent over the corpse because it's lined up right on top of the first floor beams, and therefore anything that will be between those beams of the first floor and the second floor, that will be considered contaminated as a result of the roofing of the second floor that's directly on top of the beams of the first floor. Now, al gabe Elyona, if let's say on top of the roof at the moment, or top of the beams that are on the top floor, if there is a piece of the corpse on top of the top floor, let's say, which is going to be the roof, then anything on top of that corpse in the air, there's nothing containing the contamination, because on top of the top beam on the second floor, it's just the outside, it's just the air. And therefore, if there's a corpse, the corpse contaminates all the way up, as high as it goes. So therefore, it would be ad l'rikia. It would go ahead and contaminate all the way up. Ad l'rikia tameh. Good morning, Sam. And it would contaminate all the way up. So that's what the first part of the Mishnah. Now the Mishnah continues. What happens if the beams were not lined up one with each other? Let's say the beams coming out, beams from the first floor and beams from the second floor, it looks like this. Beams are not exactly, they're offset, they're off space between each other, but they're not directly on top of each other. The beams were set up, Sam, in a way that it was like in between the lower beams. Now, in my Gemara, in the Masifta Gemara, I like the picture a lot. If you look at the picture over here, the first case was the beams are directly on top of the bottom beams. See the beams over here? They form the same shadow. In the second case, you see these beams over here? You see? Then they're like, you see the shade on the bottom. It looks like these beams, the top beams, fill the gaps of the lower beams. So that's the case right now. So if you have, they're not exactly lined directly on top of the lower beams. They are like between the lower beams. So tumah tachtehem, if the tumah is underneath, whether it's underneath the lower beams or whether it's underneath the upper beams, tameh, because there's not. Then we say, because when it would be tameh. Now, what does that mean? That means that we look at the upper. We look at, let's say, if you have contamination underneath the bottom floor, right? Underneath the bottom floor, we look at the bottom floor, the roofing of the bottom floor, which is the lower beams, as if the spaces in between are filled with the upper beams. We look at it that these upper beams fill the space. Because these upper beams, we're going to see, are a size of a tefach, the upper beams have a certain width of a tefach, we look at it as if it lowers down and fills the gap. And it fills the gap, so then you have a tent, then you have that whole bottom floor will serve as a tent to anything that's underneath it. So therefore, if there's any food, drinks, utensils underneath, on the bottom, on the ground floor, that whole floor is going to be contaminated. Anything that comes into that floor is contaminated, because if there's food, there's drink between the beams, because we don't look at there's any spacing between the beams, because we look at the top beams fill the gaps of the lower beams, between the lower beams, and it's as if you have a tent going all across. That is what it says. Meaning, in case number one, when the beams are directly on top of each other, so the bottom floor did not have a complete tent. There were spaces in between. So if you had utensils of food between the spaces on the bottom floor, on the ground of the bottom floor, they're not contaminated, because they're not under a tent, because they're not directly under if they were underneath the beam, and the contamination, the corpse is underneath the beam. So whatever's underneath the beam forms a tent, and will contaminate anything underneath the beam, but not in between the beams. In the case when the beams are directly top of each other. But when the beams are separate from each other, and there is other upper beams that are filling the gaps from the bottom floor. So then we look at it as if that's the Chavit Rami, as if it came down and it filled the gaps. Now, if it was al gabehen, if it was on top of the beams, so let's say in this case too, that the beams are not directly over each other. So if there is contamination on top of the let's say on top of the first floor, right? So what do you have? The first floor, you have the beams, and there's no beam on top. There's no beam on top of the first floor, so it's going to the first floor to the roof. There's nothing containing it. If the beams are directly on top of each other, so therefore at least the top beams will stop any contamination. That, let's say if you have a corpse on top of the bottom beams, so the top here's first floor. If the dead body is here, but the top beam will, since it's directly on top of it, will stop it from going above that roof. But if the bottom beam is not directly next to underneath the top beam, so what is therefore you have nothing on top of the beam. The first floor, if the dead body is on top of the first floor, it's going to go. Nothing. There's no roofing on top. There's no beam on top. This will go all the way to the heavens, all the way up. To the heavens is tamei, is contaminated. The Tani Allah, and Rava says that we learned in the Braita, but Medvar Mamurim, when is this talking about? We are now on 22a3. Rava says that Medvar Mamurim, the Tani Allah, Bisman sheyesh behen tefach. This is only true if the beam itself has the width of a tefach. If it has the width of a tefach, that's the size, the minimum size to be considered a tent. To be a tent, that you could go ahead and that if something's underneath you, then anything that's underneath that covering will become contaminated. Let's say if my hand is the tent, let's say. If my hand would be this thing, if there's something over here, then even if there's a dead body here, then even the food that's under the same roof, or the utensil that's on the other side of this would become contaminated. That's provided that this roofing is wide at tefach. If it's less than a tefach wide, it does not create a tent. So that provided this is the tefach, and also there's man sheish tefach u'posea and beineim posea tefach, and what's between the not only the beam is a tefach, but the spacing between the beams is the tefach, and that means that the upper beam is filling in. It has a width. So that it has the width of a tefach that's filling. It means there's a space of a tefach, and the upper beam is filling in that space. So in order for that upper beam to be considered, we consider the upper beam fills in the space, it's only if it's filling in a space of a tefach or more. But if it would be less than a tefach, the upper beam will not be able. You don't say you can fill in a space if you are less, if the space that you're filling in is less than a tefach. So therefore, but if it's not a space of a tefach in between, then you're filling in less than a tefach, and we don't say chavit rami. Tumah tachat achas mehem. Then if the tumah is under one of them, then tachteha tameh. Only underneath it. Good morning, Mr. Haber, would be contaminated, not above, because why only underneath be contaminated? Because since if it's less than a tefach, then we don't look at the upper beams as if the upper beams came down. And if we don't look at the upper beams as if the upper beams come down, so it never forms a tent. So therefore, it doesn't form a tent. So that's what the Gemara, that's what Rava wants to go ahead and we'll see tomorrow. We'll continue a little bit more tomorrow. Mr. Haber, we're talking about the idea of if you have something which is tefach wide, there's a concept that you could say that we look at if it's on top of a sukkah or in other areas, we could look at it as if it comes down. We look at something which is higher up, we could consider it sometimes as if it's lower down. Halachically, we could consider it's lower down, provided that it has a certain width of a tefach. And we'll see more tomorrow, more about this. We're starting tomorrow, 6:15. It's the new time because of Slichot.
What time is the next Shachrit?
What did you say it again?
What time is the next Shachrit?
Next Shachrit is 7:30. 6:45 is Slichot. Now every minyan Slichot is 45 minutes before the regular time. So the 7:30 minyan is 6:45 Slichot. The minyan time stays the same. So Slichot is just 45 minutes before. Next minyan is 7:30, and then it's going to be an 8 o'clock minyan also. Yeah. And Mr. Haber, that's the new